Hello there. In this video, we're going to be looking at experts and defining who we trust for the answers and who we go to for answers and why we go to those particular people. So Merriam-Webster's defines expert as someone with special skills representing mastery of a particular subject. Now, I know we all kind of knew what an expert was to begin with, but what is the real key part of an expert? It's just not knowledge. Knowledge can be obtained really easily these days, especially. So, what is it that makes somebody an expert? And I think the definition, when we look at expert as describing something, like in the adjective definition, and it's really the experience that we look at the most. And just to be, consistent, I put the definition of experience. I know you all know the definition of experience, but it's important to look at how we really define what experience is in terms of the information that we trust from people and really understanding what experience is relevant and which isn't. Sometimes if we don't really check into an expert's experience level, it doesn't really matter as much. But when it comes to medical decisions, that's something that we really should look into before we make decisions on the information that we are presented with. So this little girl is my daughter Emily, and this was taken in the fall of 2020. So during the peak of COVID, um, we went out of town to a friend's house, um, and we were lifelong friends. And the kids were doing remote school. Really, door to door wasn't, people weren't doing door to door, so it was really kind of a bummer. So we both agreed it'd be all right if we, got the kids together to, make it a better Halloween. Because it's a bummer when you're a kid and you can't really go trick or treating. So this photo was taken about an hour before she would trip and fall forward onto the concrete. Now you're probably wondering, okay, Professor Cook, why your daughter's cute and all, but why are you telling me this? Well, it has a point, and we're going to look at some experts that I would come into contact with, and kind of look at how we define an expert in through this experience. So I didn't need to be a doctor to know it wasn't good. She was in a lot of pain. It was very swollen and bruised, and she had to almost carry it in her other arm if it wasn't in ACE bandages for support. So with my limited medical knowledge, I wrapped it up in an ACE bandage for support, and we were leaving the next day to come home and to go to urgent care. And it seemed to really make her feel better, as far as support wise with her arm. I was really trying to avoid having to go to the emergency room because, like I said, this was in the peak of COVID, and emergency rooms, were really at capacity for this type of, they really didn't want to have to deal with, what could have been a sprained wrist. So my friend and I used our unprofessional opinions, and we tried to see if it was broken or not. And we made her do silly things to see if we could tell, um, if it was broken, to make a better decision on if we really needed to go to the emergency room or if we didn't. And she was really, my daughter was really miserable through it all. So we get back to Columbus and we go to urgent care. And we got an x-ray, and the doctor said it was broken, but it should only take 3 to 4 weeks to heal. So that was good. So we wrapped it up in a temporary cast, and she's still feeling absolutely miserable in this picture, as you can tell. So then we get referred to the St. Francis Orthopedic Institute, and we were set up with Dr. Blake. He specializes in orthopedics, specifically in the bones from the elbow to the fingers, and that's all he does, elbow to fingers. Um, we get more x-rays done, and he looks at it, and it turns out it's not just a simple break that will take 3 weeks to heal. The fracture's in her growth plate, and if her body doesn't let it start healing on its own, repairing the damage in the growth plate, she'll need to have surgery. If your growth plate, while you're growing as a kid, if anything happens to it, it's damaged. It can really mess up how her hand might have been deformed eventually, because if her growth plate didn't heal properly. What about the first doctor? He said it was just a simple break. So is that first doctor incompetent, and should we question, his knowledge and abilities? And what does that say about the clinic, that they were wrong? And is it something that we should, never go back to that clinic again? And not necessarily. In urgent care are general practitioners. They are all board certified doctors. X-ray techs take standard shots of the bone, whereas the specialist takes different views of the bone. So they were better able to tell in my daughter's wrist. They could see the thin line that showed it was a break in her growth plate. They were also transparent about their skill sets. That doctor didn't say, okay, you don't have to see any more doctors. I'm a doctor, and I'm telling you it's just a simple break. No, they didn't do that. They referred us to a specialist, and the doctor said, it looks like a simple break. We're going to refer you to a specialist. So it's not like he attempted to, say that his diagnosis was it, and nothing else needed to be done. And they didn't attempt to treat without a second opinion either. So when experts are wrong, it's not necessarily indicative that they are a fraud or they lack any sort of competence. So let's look at the St. Francis Orthopedic Institute. All the radiologists and x-ray techs are licensed and certified specifically in those areas. They take different angles and more specific positioning that gives the doctors better views of the bones and the smaller bones that may not be able to be seen where the standard x-ray views are taken. Every doctor in that practice specializes in a different area of bone. So notice I said Dr. Blake only handles from the elbow down to fingers. He literally will not treat you for like a knee injury. So let's look at Dr. Blake's experience and knowledge base. He went to medical school to become a doctor of osteopathy. It's specialization. I didn't know. So, in case any of you don't know this area of medicine, it focuses on the musculoskeletal system and the interconnectivity of nerves, muscles, and bones. So that's very helpful in complex breaks where there could be nerve damage, and repairing different bone structure for to help people who have those really, and especially in the fingers, that's particularly important. He had additional training and medical school to become a surgeon. So not only is he knows a lot about bones, he does orthopedic surgeries. Then he had even more specialized training for several years in hand and wrist, and all the delicate bones and settings involved in that. And he also has a doctorate in physical therapy. I don't know when the guy sleeps, but he has a lot of school knowledge. So experts and their advice. Experts can be narrowly specialized, have a broad knowledge of a subject area, and they're human beings. They can make mistakes. They're going to be wrong at some point, um, especially in the sciences. Science changes all the time. Um, and when you're wrong, it doesn't necessarily mean you're unqualified or incompetent or it's a misrepresentation of an ability. In some fields, it often takes decades to study to make a new discovery and change a way something is done and practiced. Um, and a lot of times we look to the very well-known experts, the TV doctors, the TV, the TV scientists, and but when we really think about it, most experts, they're not widely known. Within the field of orthopedics, I'm sure Dr. Blake is, people know him, especially in the Southeast region. But probably, an orthopedic surgeon in New York probably has never heard of Dr. Blake. But they at least, even if they don't know the the expert specifically, usually within fields, um, it's easy to find out. They and definitely within the local base of a expert area. Within Columbus, Dr. Blake is going to be very well known. In Columbus, we can use my expert. I'm an expert in information literacy, misinformation and disinformation, and teaching all of the above to students and demonstrate and how to do research skills. And within Columbus, and maybe even the Chattahoochee Valley, if you said Allison Cook, most librarians wouldn't know who I am, or at least have heard of me. They may not know about me specifically. But as we go into Southwest Georgia, probably outside of Columbus, nobody's ever heard of me. Let's go into the state of Georgia. Chances are no one's heard of me, and definitely within the Southeast and I'm definitely not nationally or internationally known. That doesn't mean that my expertise isn't valid, um, just because I don't have an international reputation. So reputation is important, but it's important to keep in mind the scale of the reputation that we're looking at. So a lot of the information I found, I knew about X-ray views and whatnot. I asked a nurse practitioner at the St. Francis Orthopedic Institute. I asked her questions because around that time I had been writing the expert part of this course, and I thought my daughter's story might be a good example of looking at experts and one expert being wrong and seeking the advice of another expert. So in my discussion with her, I asked her about Dr. Blake and his specializations. And one thing to note that she told me about, to keep in mind is, if Dr. Blake was at the park and saw someone fall, and it was fairly obvious the person broke their leg, he would be able to, triage it, splint it, get the person to emergency help if needed. He could read the x-rays accurately, and he'd probably know the protocol for treatment if surgery was needed, or if just a casting would be sufficient. But even with all his training, if someone broke their leg, he would refer him to Dr. McCluskey, who does ankle and feet, and Dr. Zimmerman, who does knee, hip, and femurs. So I found that interesting that, and not all experts, and not all experts will do this, but experts really know their skill set and they know the limitations of their skill set, and they're not, um, they don't feel it's beneath them to say, "Hey, this is out of my specialization. These other two doctors would be much better." But of course, he can triage, and he has the knowledge of. I mean, he spent years and years in medical school, osteopathy school, in orthopedic surgery. So, but I think, over my course of studying misinformation and information literacy, I think the best experts know their limitations and um, aren't ashamed to say, this is out of my expertise. We're getting outside my expertise zone. These experts are probably the better experts that you need, because they specialize in your specific problem. So, just to let you know what happened to my daughter, all was well. 8 weeks later, um, by December 28th of 2020, the final cast came off, and it was just in time for her ninth birthday. And then a few months later, we had a final follow-up X-ray just to make sure everything was looking good. And you would have never, there was barely any evidence that anything had happened. So we were really appreciative of Dr. Blake and the St. Francis Orthopedic Institute. It's a wonderful, wonderful group of people if you ever break a bone. So we're going to look at a couple examples of scenarios, and most of them are completely made up. And we're going to go over and talk about some situations where two different people in a field can have very similar knowledge experience, but one might be a better choice over another. And depending on the situation and what's at stake, meaning who what happens if that expert's wrong, or you don't look into that expert enough, the consequences of what can happen. A lot of times with experts, and I use air quotes for that, they have a lot of knowledge and experience, but it's not quite in what they claim to be an expert in. So it's important to really discern um, who we trust for information and who we deem an expert. Because of this, there's some decisions we'll make if we trust the wrong expert. It's not a big deal, but sometimes it literally is life or death. So we're going to look at a chef, for example, and who the expert is. Chef one has a lot of formal education, but his resume is fairly short, and he does lots of work to know his local produce and meats and the growers of those locally grown vegetables and meats. He travels to learn how to authentically cook food from different cultures. Expert or chef number two, he doesn't really have any formal training. He's more self-taught, but he has a lot of experience, and he worked in some pretty high caliber restaurants in New York City. He has 20 years total experience. And throughout his experience, he developed relationships with vendors, and really knows where to get the finest quality and unique foods within his local area, and know about the foods that and spices that are grown locally within his area. So who do you consider the expert? Oops. And there really is no answer, right or wrong answer to this one. And it really all depends on, the situation. Maybe one has more experience in the type of food that you're looking to eat that night. Um, and our food preferences are just different sometimes. It can depend on what the chef's specialty is. Maybe his specialty is, you know, chef one's specialty is chicken parmesan, but you don't like chicken parmesan. Um, but that doesn't mean he's any less of an expert. You're just not going to like his food. So in this situation, when we look at chefs, um, it's okay to have experience. Having experiential learning can be just as good as formal education at fancy restaurant schools. So let's look at another one. So someone is, God forbid, diagnosed with cancer. Um, they really don't want to go through the standard treatment of chemo, and heard about a natural therapy regimen that they read about. And the doctor who who's had a lot of success with this treatment protocol, um, you know, used it in conjunction with a vegetarian diet. So based on this description, would you consider this expert? Would you consider this person an expert, or do you think you'd refer your friend to seek other medical advice? So probably on first look, we would probably ask questions of our friend, just so they're looking at all the important things that they should look at in, when selecting a treatment. Sometimes, cancer can be a pretty shocking diagnosis. So, sometimes people get so shocked they'd rather run away from it versus getting the treatment. So you decide to look into the doctor's expertise, and turns out the doctor graduated from Columbia University, 10 years in laboratory experience, 10 years in conducting research, and her primary research is focused in natural therapeutics for cancer. So this expert's sounding a lot better than we once thought. Has a really good academic background, has uh, tons of experience in researching cancer, and especially within natural therapeutics. So it's starting to look a little better. Maybe this treatment program isn't that bad. So do we consider her an expert? Well, what if we changed her experience a little bit? She was graduated from Columbia, but her medical degree is in veterinary medicine. And her laboratory and research work studied is in canines. It's for dogs. She's seen some success in treating cancer with natural remedies and changing their diet. And her work that's widely published is in veterinary journals. She published the information as a protocol for humans, just as something for humans to consider, not as not as a treatment that is currently working. Um, so in this case, knowing her specialization, and where the information came from, and the context of that information is important when we get information from experts. Sometimes, uh, we all have that probably family member or friend that publishes something on social media that might be conventionally considered a little wonky. and they take the information that's in the social media post really seriously. And after you look at it, you think, this isn't really, you can't find the evidence that it was written by an expert or the information was verified by experts and peer reviewed. It's really just kind of anecdotal evidence. And anecdotal evidence is, just a few stories of success or no success. Anecdotes. There's no real large scale study done. It's just the stories that you hear um, throughout a lot of COVID treatments that as they popped up through 2020. A lot of times they were based on anecdotal evidence. One doctor had success using this, one doctor had success using that, or one person felt better after using this vitamin or that vitamin. So it's anecdotal evidence is just the random stories that you come across that there's no trend or definitive proof that um, uh, you know a, a, a treatment or anything is um, guaranteed to work. It's just random stories that you hear throughout that whatever that topic is. So let's look at the same scenario, but um, the treatment is a highly talked about new natural cancer treatment said to be very successful by a doctor at Harvard University. He markets a natural treatment protocol to treat cancer and has many studies about the protocol of the successes. But then we dig a little deeper, and the doctor is actually a PhD in clinical psychology. The treatments are based on anecdotal stories from people he knows from his psychology practice. He consulted with homeopathic practitioners to create his natural regimen. So when we add this information to an expert, whether or not we'd consider somebody an expert to treat cancer, um, on the surface level, he looks like he might be a true expert, and we should take the information that he publishes, put it in a higher regard than others. But then when we look a little deeper, we find that's not really the case. So it's important to have that discernment of looking a little deeper in the experts that we trust. And I'm using some pretty obvious examples, using cancer as an example. Um, that's something that most people would, go seek a lot of different opinions, a lot of different, research, and, not just based on someone who says that they have a Harvard degree or, you know, they're, uh, they're called Dr. Smith. Um, Learning where that doctor comes from. Is it actually a medical degree doctor or is it a PhD doctor? And not to say that PhDs are lesser but it's important to know if it's a MD doctor or a PhD is they're different, and you're going to want in certain situations it matters if especially in medical situations you need a medical doctor um, um, more than especially in an active treatment of cancer. So a lot of times we see these particularly advertisement for these great products that um, will help you be feel better and get boosts of energy, and you don't need to take pharmaceutical um, drugs because there's a natural better way to do it to get that same effect. and we'd all like to, you know, sometimes it matters to us reducing the amount of pharmaceutical, um, supplements or medications that we take. But it's important to really look at the experience, um, and the education, the knowledge, the length of study, um, to really discern. And there really is no formula to discern who gets to be the expert and who gets to be the expert on a particular area. This could be seen in the past few years with COVID, and I think a lot of the problem where information conflicted with one another is we were watching science happen in real time. Um, we we watched treatments come out very rapidly, a vaccine come out in record time, and in some people thought that that was a miracle, and some people were very skeptical of it. How could, some vaccines took 10 years to produce? How could this one that only took a few months be safe when it was so quickly created? And then you have people claiming to be experts in virology, but viruses is a huge specialization, and most doctors will specialize in a particular type of virus. Um, so you have people who study coronaviruses, and there's lots of different. That alone kind of freaked people out, not realizing and not being explained to by um, you know the information wasn't put out in a way where the public could understand. Coronavirus is the general category of the type of virus and why it was named that, and why it was called, why it's called that, and why it's a lot of confusion came over. Oh, it's just like the common cold. No, they're a similar virus, but they're definitely not the same. So, and you had a lot of experts, using air quotes, even experts in virology, but one doctor who had studied Ebola, which is a much, much different virus than coronaviruses or even influenza viruses. So, um, there were a lot of voices speaking all at once, and it's hard to discern who's right. And while we're watching science happen in real time, and science happening very quickly because the stakes were pretty high to get this under control, um, you had a lot of conflicting information. And the media, and this is really where a lot of what we've been learning all semester kind of intertwines in comes together, where you have a huge problem of information and information dissemination about a global pandemic, and the public, large parts of the public, rejecting or accepting the information, and kind of turning on one another when one group wouldn't follow the advice of the experts they believe versus the other side's belief in a different expert. And so when more and more information would come out, our biases would come into play. Well, we have the reactance effect with mask wearing, where somebody tells you not to do something and you want to do that very thing they tell you not to do. We have the Dunning-Kruger effect, where we're putting a lot of people would put a lot of weight into something they read on Facebook by a quote air quotes expert, but then they have another doctor with 20, 30 years of medical experience and studying viruses and or epidemiology, and they're seen as the idiot, whereas the Facebook expert is seen as valid. And so that's where an aspect of Dunning-Kruger where you put a lot of weight into the person with less experience versus the person with more experience. So, and then we with confirmation bias is a huge part of people accepting or rejecting information in COVID. Confirmation bias, we believe if we already have a preconceived idea about the pandemic, about the virus, about what public health officials are the job they're doing in working to end the pandemic or whatnot, where once we get that preconceived belief, we're gonna, a lot of people let their bias creep in that they're only going to pay attention to the information that confirms that belief or talk to people that has the same belief. So, and when it comes to experts, people can, polish their expertise in a nice presentation. And we saw that in my example of the first doctor. And a lot of, and in that case, it wasn't a malicious attempt at misinformation. It was just they read something from somebody's blog that was taken out of context, and they didn't really dig any deeper to really find out her expertise. But with when we're looking at information that we accept or reject from people, it's really easy to let our biases creep in of who we trust and don't trust. And sometimes it's not necessarily even a person, it's a institution or you know or a particular information source like a news media outlet or a magazine or medical journal that is accepted or rejected. So it's easy to just hear a fancy name of someone's experience and that's that's it. They're an expert. Not everyone that graduates from Harvard is an expert in everything. It's a very prestigious school. It's a very good school, and depending, they probably produce a lot of experts in a lot of different fields. But on the same token, you know, you know, somebody who graduates as a chemist to become a pharmacist has an expertise that's different than somebody who is going there to become a psychiatrist or a general practitioner. So let's look at me. And we've already talked a little bit about me and my expertise. But would you consider me an expert when we take a look at my professional background again? I have a master's degree in library and information science from the University of Kentucky. While in school, I spent 2 years working in academic libraries, and ever since 2012, I've worked in when I graduated in 2012. So I've spent since 2012 going on over 10 years working in academic libraries. I spent 3 years at Columbus Technical College as a serials and assessment librarian. And what that means, serials are reoccurring journals or magazines. Serial publication is just something that has editions, and it could be a daily edition like a newspaper, a monthly edition like a lot of journal articles, or bi-monthly every other month, or quarterly. So an assessment is just looking at if programming or the different elements of a library are working and how to measure that. Oh, I did change this part of the slide. um, I've been a professor at CSU since 2015. So I have a lot of experience in being a librarian and a research information literacy expert, particularly in the subject areas of business, political science, criminal justice, and government information. And we mentioned that um, it's important to look at experts as human beings. When we hear experts, we assume that they know everything about everything, especially within their field. And a lot of times they do. They're very knowledgeable, but they're also human beings. Um, and just because you have an expert and you practice, um, you know, your 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 trade or your medical skills or your whatever your expertise is in, you're actively practicing it. And I don't mean that in like a musician sense, although that could be one. Um, knowledge changes. Knowledge changes daily. So experts in my credits and in my failures, I continually participate in workshops and conferences to really learn about best practices in research in my subject areas that people ask specific research questions in those disciplines. Um, I take courses to better learn about subject areas. I'm not an expert in business, but I am an expert in how to research business topics and how to locate information that's important to that discipline so that when a student asks me, how can I find this, you know, company's yearly filing, I know what he's talking about first off, and then second of all, I can show him in a timely manner how to locate that information. Um, I'm currently practicing and active in my career. I've been working as an academic librarian for 10 years, and so I've stacked up experience through that. Some experts, they're retired or they were a practicing doctor um, maybe for 10 years, but 20 years ago. So things like that you're going to want to look at. I perpetually work with other faculty members on their research projects. Um, I've presented my own research at the Georgia Library Association. So I tell you this because I have a reputation. I perpetually build my reputation so that if you do a Google search of me, I might not be on the top 2 pages, but eventually you'll start seeing some of my work or where I've presented. And at least within the CSU and Columbus, Georgia communities, where that's really the most important area, of my career, at least right now, to work with and collaborate with other faculty members. So I can see how other faculty do things and how they teach things and their expertise levels. So I can always keep on top of best practices and whatnot. Um, and I'm also active in, um, the library community within Columbus and within Georgia itself. I serve as the uh, academic librarian at the Columbus Technical College Library Advisory Council, and part of the technical college, for different committees. Um, that's just the way they want academic librarian and a public librarian in the library committee. So um, experts are perpetually serving on different boards or they're in their communities, helping others within their field, to to not just do better in their own profession, but to help the profession, or in this case at Columbus Tech, um, they need somebody to serve in that role. So I volunteered. I was asked, and I volunteered to serve in that role. If I didn't, they'd probably have to find somebody else, but that can be a challenge, depending on, and Columbus is not that big of a town, so you're almost limited in who you can ask for an academic librarian that's outside the Columbus Technical College. But I've also had failures. I've taught online classes that were complete failures. I've tried new ideas and they were terrible, and it sounded real good, but in practice it just wasn't. I've presented at conferences and the presentation just didn't go well. I've started research projects and just kind of lost interest in it. Um, and I don't know everything about everything related to information literacy and misinformation and disinformation. That's a information is as and one of the reasons why we went over the information industry. Information's a big, big uh, area of industry and knowledge, and it's a big area, a subject area, and it can be very broad, but it can also be really specific. So if somebody comes up to me and wants to know about a topic related to education, I'm able to help them in a general sense, where I can show them where Galileo is, how to refine their searches, how to do a lot of things that will take the frustration out of using Galileo if you're not familiar with it. But then when it comes down to the real specialized databases, I don't know all of those. I'm not the best person to ask. Michelle Jones would be the person to ask for, but I can help a student get started if Michelle isn't here, and what they can email Michelle or call her, and they can, they can set up an appointment where they can get that specialized help. But I will never tell a student or faculty member that that's it, I've helped you and you don't need to know anymore, because that just isn't true. And that would just be a lot of times if you say see an expert saying I'm the expert, and anybody else who decides you know has a different opinion or different um, has different ideas, they're just automatically wrong. A lot of times it's their ego talking. And when you bring your ego into especially learning and education, and teaching others, and depending on the profession, it can be dangerous. So at least in libraries, I don't have a big enough ego where I think I can handle it all. You know, where we have subject librarians here for a reason. Um, and often I can't find information immediately on the fly. Often I get asked to help search for something, and on the fly, I can't always find it, right away. A lot of people expect me to be like Google, and I'll just know where it is. Well, what sets me apart from a different person is I understand how databases work a lot better. I know how they work. I know how to find ways to make them search more effectively and efficiently. So just because an expert doesn't know or can't produce the information like as fast as a computer, doesn't mean that they're still not an expert. And we'll review this information later in the course. But in the regards of using library databases, if I'm in a class showing that how to search a database within Galileo, chances are I've practice it beforehand. Like I searched the topic ahead of time because a lot of times I have 40 minutes to show a class of students, so they don't have time for me to fumble. So I got to kind of, be quick to the point. So before I go to the class, I'll, look to see which keywords are better to look at than others. So it's just for the sake of time. But if somebody comes to me in person and asks for help, sometimes I have to say, you know what? So you're not just sitting here watching me do searches. Let me take a look at this, and I'll email you information or if you want to come back in a little bit. It's going to take me a little bit to figure this out because sometimes topics, information databases are indexed by humans. So, sometimes I have to crack the code of how it was indexed. That topic was particularly indexed. So the point. When you're consuming information, you really have to consider the source. And even when it's, like I said, the expert is wrapped in a shiny package, an expert in one area isn't an expert in all areas. And you should be particularly discerning when information matters, when somebody's health is on the line, or even life is on the line. It's easy to fall into the, get in the shiny, Ivy League schools of experts, but Ivy Leagues don't always produce an automatic expert. They, somebody who graduates from Yale needs just as much experience in medicine as somebody who graduates from New York University. Really look at their education and practical experience background. Make sure if you're looking at health information, you're looking at the MD versus the PhD. And even that, sometimes depending on what your question is, that you might need the PhD in a health issue versus the MD. And most of the time, reputation is everything. And by this, I mean, not everyone's going to like the TV doctor, but is it because of politics, or is it because they are a truly terrible doctor? People died under their immediate direct care. If they have a terrible reputation outside of a political arena, looking at the job they do that in their field of expertise, I may not, this isn't true, I may not have liked Dr. Blake as a person, or he might have been, real abrasive personality. That doesn't detract from him being an expert in orthopedics. And when you're engaging with someone, whether it's a friend, a colleague, a coworker, and they make a statement that is critical, and they themselves are not an expert, find out where they heard it from and dig a little deeper. We always want to trust the people that we love the most or are closest to, because we know they typically have our best interests at heart. But at the same time, they're infallible too. They have the same biases that other people do. So where do they hear it from? And depending on what the information is for, will make you need to have to dig a little deeper if you want the most accurate information. And continuing on into this semester related to media and information, there's a lot of information available where everyone's an expert, everybody read it somewhere or saw it on the news or says an expert said. And we're going to go over a little bit more on discerning information that we consume by really dissecting it. And we're going to go over fact checking and how to do it quickly, because we all don't have Galileo at our fingertips sometimes. nor do we want to have Galileo at our fingertips to fact check something. We're going to go over what I call 5-minute fact checks, where you can quickly look at something when you need it immediately. How to do that when you need it fast, but you need it accurate as well. And this part, experts, has a lot to play in being able to fact check quickly, because if you know that it's a doctor that has been known for selling supplements that don't work, or he's been in trouble legally for selling supplements that haven't worked in the past, that's something you want to know about. And just to remember, an expert knows an area and is not afraid to admit when something is outside their scope of study, and has no problem being transparent about it. Really, transparency in fake news, when a lot of failures or credits are disclosed ahead of time, that's probably the best information you should consider, because transparency means that they want you to know exactly what their expertise is and what they're presenting you and the type of information it is. So the more transparent of how an expert comes to a conclusion, the more transparent they are in a journal article that they publish, is usually an indicator that at least there's good faith in the information that's being presented. An expert has book knowledge and expertise. And sometimes it doesn't have to be formal education, like in the chef's situation. Some of the best chefs that the culinary world has seen were home-trained home cooks. They can produce evidence that they have a deep understanding of the subject. And this doesn't necessarily have to be a diploma or a degree or certification, but they can produce something as just a resume. If they have 15 years of experience in studying lung cancer, they're probably a good person to see for lung cancer. Has a good reputation in the discipline and industry based on their abilities, is constantly learning. Fields change. So somebody who doesn't perpetually learn in their field is probably eventually going to be obsolete, and you really can't, not that you maybe not trust the information is a little strong, but the information that they're providing for you is out of date, so it's not quality information that you may need to answer a question. They're selective in discounting opinions and other treatment, and experts will produce evidence why they're discounting, whether it's a verbal testimony or they can show research. And lastly, an expert is typically extremely knowledgeable in a specific area and generally knowledgeable in a general topic. So like the bone example I gave, we have a doctor, general practitioner, who's an expert in just the general body issues. But then we have Dr. Blake, who is only elbow, the elbow down, elbow bones and down. So we are going to be in the discussion forum talking about experts, and it's called Draw an Expert because originally this was face-to-face class, so you literally drew an expert. So think about who you trust in certain situations for information. Who do you rely on as an expert? So if you have any other questions, feel free to contact me, and look to CougarView for your assignment and discussion question prompts, and I will see you there. Have a great day.